Hello there, I'm Nick Clark. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, who blinked first? The US and China have agreed to slash tariffs temporarily in a surprise breakthrough. Is it a total reset in trade ties, as Donald Trump says, or is it just a brief thaw? It's the first major trade deal of Trump's second term. The US-UK Pact was hailed by leaders, but slammed by some business owners. So will it deliver real benefits, or is it symbolism over substance? Senegal is capitalizing on its newfound oil and gas wealth to transform its fortunes, but many Senegalese people say they're cut off from resources and profit. All right, it seemed almost impossible just a few days ago. The US and China have surprisingly agreed to a dramatic de-escalation in their trade war. Under the agreement, the world's two largest economies have paused respective tariffs for 90 days. And that breaks an impasse which has brought much of the commerce between the two nations to a halt. The confrontation has threatened to fuel inflation in the US and stoke unemployment in China. The breakthrough is a sigh of relief for global investors, many businesses and consumers for now. Critics, though, say the talks in Geneva didn't appear to yield any meaningful concessions. The two sides aim to reach a broader deal, but this takes too long to negotiate. The big question is, what happens after 3 months? Michael Apple has this report.
A trade war between the United States and China is halted for now. Successful trade talks in Geneva have dramatically eased tensions. China's vice premier saying the result is something to build on.
The two sides agreed on establishing a China-US consultation mechanism. We have identified the lead persons for each side and will carry on further discussions.
Tensions between the two superpowers escalated quickly following Donald Trump's return to the White House. By mid-April, American tariffs imposed on Chinese imports stood at an unprecedented 145%. Beijing responding with levies of 125% on US goods.
Where they were last week was absolutely apocalyptic. It would have resulted in supply chain disruptions that would have been something like the pandemic. There would have effectively been no trade between the United States and China.
That would have resulted in an economic principle referred to as decoupling, something the US says it doesn't want, and that it's just trying to ensure trade conditions with Beijing are fairer.
Neither side wants a decoupling. And what had occurred with these very high tariffs, as Ambassador Greer said, was the equivalent of an embargo.
Trump's been in office for more than 3 months. During this time, he's upended decades-old alliances and whipped global markets into a frenzy, confusing and antagonizing friend and foe alike.
Common sense. It's all about common sense.
His preferred instrument in waging his administration's so-called common sense approach to issues like trade? Tariffs. While few, if any, markets have escaped Washington's scrutiny, more than any other country in the world, China has been the main target. But after months of tough talk, Trump's rhetoric appears to have softened.
I think it's going to be fantastic for China. I think it's going to be fantastic for us. And I think it's going to be great for unification and peace.
Trump's so-called Liberation Day announcement of reciprocal tariffs at the beginning of April succeeded only in liberating trillions of dollars from the value of the global market. But dollar and stock indices are surging off the back of the Geneva announcement. It's a reprieve for investors and businesses that have faced an onslaught of uncertainty for months. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, here's a snapshot of US-China trade and what this latest 90-day temporary tariff reduction involves. Last year, US-China trade totaled $585 billion, and the trade imbalance favored Beijing significantly. In 2024, the US imported $440 billion worth of goods and services from China, while US exports to Beijing accounted for $145 billion. US tariffs on China rocketed from 10% in early February to 145% by early April. China retaliated with a 15% tax on US imports, escalating it to 125% by mid-April. Both have now agreed to slash tariffs by 115% for a 3-month period while they negotiate a more comprehensive deal. So let's take this on now with David Lubin, who's a Michael Klein Senior Research Fellow at the Global Economy and Finance Program at Chatham House. David, great to have you with us. Appreciate your company. So is this a Trump retreat, would you say?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, the retreat started on the 9th of April when Trump announced the 90-day suspension of the reciprocal tariffs. And I think the agreement reached in Geneva last weekend is a sort of continuation of that retreat. And this is all a response to the very hostile market reaction that Trump suffered in the aftermath of Liberation Day on the 2nd of April. Trump has kind of shown, I think, that his willingness to impose a lot of economic and financial pain on the US economy is limited. And the limits of that were on display at the weekend in Geneva.
Do you think China's retaliation was all part of this? Because they did hit back with very high tariffs themselves.
Yes, I mean, I think, China has a lot of leverage in these negotiations. It can restrict market access to China for US firms. It can restrict US access to critical minerals and key inputs into supply chains. And I think it's also worth bearing in mind that Xi Jinping has the advantage of not having to face midterm elections in November 2026, as Donald Trump does. And I think that is kind of part of the background to Trump's sensitivity to the market, very hostile market reaction to his announcements early last month.
What about US leverage? What does Donald Trump have to play with on that front?
Yeah. I mean, I think the US has got 3 big advantages. One is that it's much bigger, it's a bigger economy than China's, and that allows it to kind of withstand some pain in a sort of bilateral trade conflict. The second is that the United States is a more closed economy. In other words, it's less trade dependent. So a kind of trade shock on the face of it doesn't have as negative an impact on the US economy as it does on China, which is a much more open, much more trade dependent economy. And the third source of US leverage, I think, is the fact that the US is the deficit country. And if you're the deficit country in a bilateral trade conflict, you can impose a lot more tariffs on the other guy than he can on you. And so there are, both countries, both the US and China, have leverage in these negotiations. They use their leverage, and the result of that was a sort of market-pleasing deal at the end of the weekend in Geneva.
And of course, I suppose Donald Trump would say it was all part of the plan, wouldn't he, to create the spectre of these mega tariffs in order to bring people to the negotiating table, particularly China in this case.
Yes, but although, it's worth bearing in mind that as long as the 30% tariff remains, and it's worth bearing in mind, so the tariff that currently exists on China is the 20% of the fentanyl tariffs, plus the 10% baseline tariff, plus 10% of tariffs that kind of were inherited from the first Trump administration. So it's not really 30%, it's more like a 40% tariff that Chinese exports coming to the US face. And a 10% tariff on Chinese imports from the United States. So the tariffs are still punitive, but they're punitive at a level which is not devastating. They're just punitive at a level which is kind of uncomfortable.
So what's your sense of where we're going to end up here? Because Trump presumably wants a much better deal than the level we're at now.
Yes, I mean, I suspect one way of thinking about the sort of next landing zone is that the US and China will enter into another kind of purchase agreement, not dissimilar to the one that was agreed in 2020, in which the Chinese would commit to importing more US energy, liquefied natural gas, more agriculture, more Boeing aircraft, and et cetera. And that will, allow Donald Trump to say that the bilateral trade deficit with China is guaranteed to decline, and that should give Donald Trump at least some semblance of a win.
But all these trade negotiations, as we know, take a long, long time. How long will this take? And in the meantime, what will the impact be on global trade?
Well, actually, I mean, paradoxically, the immediate impact on global trade will be to boost it, because there are going to be a lot of firms globally that are worried about the possibility that after the 90-day suspension of reciprocal tariffs that was announced on the 9th of April, that once we get into July, tariffs may come back onto the Trump agenda. And so the immediate impact of all of this policy chaos is to boost global trade. But as you rightly indicate, I think the longer term impact of all of this kind of, all of this use of tariffs is to depress global trade. And that's particularly damaging, I think, for developing countries, which are kind of canonically small, open, i.e. trade dependent economies. And that will be bad news indeed.
Indeed. All right, David, we'll leave it there. Appreciate that. Thanks very much. David Lubin from the Global Economy and Finance Programme at Chatham House. Thanks a lot. Now, it was seen as a deal that could set the tone for other trading partners to reverse President Donald Trump's so-called reciprocal tariffs. The UK has clinched the first trade pact with Trump since he imposed blanket duties on countries worldwide. Trump agreed to roll back some of the punitive levies he issued on British products. The president says it's a great comprehensive deal that will boost US agricultural exports, while the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has hailed it as a historic one that will save thousands of jobs in the United Kingdom. But critics say it's scant on details, limited in scope, and leaves Britain facing a tougher trading relationship with the US than before Trump introduced global tariffs last month. While most British imports will still face a 10% tariff under Trump's reciprocal tariff policy, the agreement is not legally binding, and the two sides are set to continue negotiating reductions on, quote, sectors of importance. The US ran a goods trade surplus of almost $12 billion with the UK in 2024. That's according to Census Bureau data. And total trade in goods between the two nations is worth $148 billion, making the UK America's 9th largest trading partner, behind Vietnam and ahead of India. All right, let's have a closer look at what's been agreed so far. Well, the UK can now export 100,000 vehicles each year at a reduced 10% rate. Britain currently imposes a 10% levy on US car imports, but it's not clear if there's any change to this. A tariff of 25% on British steel and aluminium exports to the US has been reduced to zero. Trump says Rolls-Royce will be able to export its engines and plane parts to the US tariff-free. The UK has scrapped a 20% tariff on American beef exports and raised the quota to 13,000 metric tons, but maintaining food standards. The two sides agreed to work on a digital trade pact and to negotiate further on pharmaceutical goods. Let's take all of this on with Chris Southworth, who's a UK Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce, joins us from Manchester in the United Kingdom. Chris, great to have you with us. So, both sides have said the specifics are still being ironed out, but how limited is the deal, in fact, in scope, would you say?
Well, if I may, I think that understanding the backdrop here is really important in the context of the UK, because what we're facing is what the rest of the world is facing. So I think what's interesting at the moment is we now know roughly what the range is that we're dealing with as a global community. So the UK is probably one of the most level economies with the US, but we've still remained with a 10% tariff. So that's a sort of lower baseline. And then we've seen China, which is probably the least level economy, landing around 30%, 30 to 40%. So that's probably the upper range. And that gives everybody else probably a landing zone somewhere in between those two figures. But we're also seeing a reordering, a redrawn map on new actors stepping forward to stabilize the global system, which is the 87% of the global trading system that doesn't rely on the US. And that's really interesting. So, and that includes the EU talking to China and vice versa, the Asia group talking to the EU and vice versa. And then you've got the likes of China, Japan, and South Korea talking for the very first time. I mean, all of that represents well over 50% of global trade. And you can see new actors coming to play, one of which is the UK. So the deal with the US is a sign of the role the UK is playing here, like the UK-India deal as well, which is interesting.
What about the personal approach that we've seen from Keir Starmer? He's certainly avoided confrontation, isn't he? Perhaps even fawning some might say. Is that something that other leaders from other countries looking to negotiate with Trump should look to?
Well, it's all diplomacy, isn't it? You know, we don't want a trade war, is the truth of it. You know, if you look at UK growth, it's sub 1%. You know, our number one priority in the UK is growth. We don't want damage being done from a trade war. And I think, you know, Keir Starmer and the UK have done actually a great job of being very, very diplomatic, getting a reasonable sort of damage limitation exercise. Actually, one of the most important aspects of last week was a commitment to a digital trade agreement. Now, that has real potential on areas like finance, investment, making trade flow cheaper, faster, simpler. That could benefit all US companies and UK companies. That's really exciting. So I think they've done quite well, but there's clearly lots of uncertainty still to come. And that's really problematic in terms of business confidence, which is, you know, by the way, at record levels, low levels, I should say. A recent ICC survey set out 70% of global businesses are not confident about the future. That's not good as a backdrop for growth. And the UK is part of that, of course.
Chris, just hang on there, because there's something else you mentioned I want to ask you about, and it's this. After years of negotiations, Britain and India have secured what both countries consider a historic trade agreement. The deal significantly cuts levies on 90% of British imports into India, with many products becoming tariff-free. Within a decade, almost all Indian exports to the UK will also face no levies. And the agreement aims to increase bilateral trade by $34 billion by 2040. It is the biggest and most economically significant deal struck by the UK since leaving the European Union 5 years ago. So, Chris, what's your take on this? What do you make of it? And are we going to see more bilateral deals going on?
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, you know, and there's opportunities here to revisit trade deals as well, the likes of Canada, for instance. But the India deal is really exciting. You know, this is the first time we've had a deal. We're both Commonwealth countries, so we begin the conversation with a 21% advantage, and everything else announced is on top of that. So it is a big deal. India is a huge economy, fast growing, will become a much bigger economy with a very, very close relationship with the UK. But there have been sticking points in the past, which is why we haven't had a deal. So I think this is a huge breakthrough. It's good news. And it's good news for the broader Commonwealth network as well, who are all meeting in June in Namibia to map out how to grow trade and, again, you know, keep trade flowing across that Commonwealth network. So I think this is really, really exciting and definitely interesting in the context of the US deal on the one hand and then the India deal on the other, all happening within the space of a day or two. You saw two quite contrasting outcomes from both of those discussions.
It's certainly all happening. Chris, we'll leave it there for now. Chris Southworth, UK Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. Thanks very much. And President Trump's latest tariffs extend beyond trade to even the big screen. He's announced a 100% tax on all films produced outside the United States. It is unclear if the tariffs will apply to movies on streaming services as well as those shown in theatres. There's been a sharp decline in film and TV production in Hollywood over the past decade, and he believes the levy will protect the country's movie industry, which he says has been decimated. Now, rocketing gold prices may be a boon for some of Africa's most cash-strapped countries. Several African nations are taking measures to boost bullion reserves and revenues, and they're also revising mining laws to attract foreign investment. In Zimbabwe, production of the precious metal surged 61% in April from a year earlier. Ghana's gold export earnings jumped by 3/5 in the first 2 months of the year. Its central bank has boosted reserves of the metal, a move that's helped stabilize its volatile currency. Namibia is also adding more gold to its reserves. Senegal has exported its first shipment of liquefied natural gas in a major step into the global energy industry. But as gas is delivered to Europe, many Senegalese homes remain without power. Nicholas Hack reports from the northern city of St. Louis.
On land, and yet lost. In the distance, it appears like a lighthouse, BP's liquefied natural gas platform, so close, yet unreachable. The fishermen were trained in waves, promised a place on the rig. Days turned to months, months to years. The call still hasn't come.
Until now, no one is working there. Now, every time I'm looking at the platform, my heart hurts. It hurts so much.
There's no more fish for us to catch. Some are around the rig. We can't even come close.
When I see the platform, I feel contempt. It's like a luxurious European country standing in our own waters while we live in small huts. When they made the discoveries, they said it would become the Dubai of Africa.
Young men gather around one of the few who made it to the rig. Sar speaks of a floating city with restaurants, gyms, air conditioning, even 24-hour electricity. A kind of life that feels oceans away.
The gas is run by Europeans, not Senegalese. Out there at sea, it's mostly foreigners. You barely see any locals. That's why I keep telling young people, get training. This could create a lot of jobs and stop migration.
In April, BP's first gas shipment set sails away from Senegal to France, fuel to warm Europeans eager to fill Russia's void. A share of the gas is promised for locals when the country's ready to receive it, BP says. For now, many Senegalese still live without electricity. So these children are explaining to me that this is what's left of their home and their school. And it's all been destroyed, they say, by the rising tide. We're just 10 kilometers away from the platform. And the people that live in these neighborhoods were told that the wealth that would come from the export of oil and gas would change their circumstances. But look at it now. Change has yet to come. Senegal's new leaders want to renegotiate the old contracts, saying they're unfair. The government has not responded to our repeated requests for an interview or comment. But last year, on national television, the oil and gas minister said the cost of power will drop.
We are trying to address this domestic use of this gas, which will greatly contribute to making access to energy more affordable and sustainable.
Efforts are currently underway to change the country's grid system to be able to be powered by its own gas. Still, the deal remains shrouded in fog. To many, it's a stolen treasure beneath the waves, plundered by others, leaving behind vanishing fish, shifting tides, and a life unchanged on land. Nicholas Hawke, Al Jazeera, counting the cost, Saint Louis.
Let's explore this further with Cheno Sedo Lee, who is the founder of Elite Energy Consulting, joins us now from Dhaka. Cheno, great to have you with us. First up, just tell us about this potential, this LNG potential for Senegal. How important is it?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I think Senegal gets world-class natural gas resources estimated at more than 40 TCF. TCF means trillion cubic feet, which is very huge for a new country entering in the oil and gas sector. The production of these gas resources started last year on December, and with GTA project, which is a very innovative project. This project is recognized as being the deepest water LNG project with the fastest final investment decision. The reserves in Senegal are very huge for a new country. And for this GTA project that cross border with Senegal and Mauritania, the plateau right now will be 2.5 MTPA, but the objective in the coming years will be to reach 10 MTPA of plateau.
And do you think that collective effort by African nations, can fill the Russian gap in Europe?
I think the objective is not to replace the Russian gas. I think the objective of Senegal and Mauritania is to be competitive, to have a competitive gas, which is right now the case. In terms of comparison, Senegal has some advantage compared to US gas or the other countries. The first advantage is we have a low-cost gas, we have low carbon gas, and we have a good geographical position compare US or other countries.
You say low carbon. We should just say, low carbon doesn't mean it's clean. It's just cleaner compared to coal and,
yes,
and oil, right?
We we have very clean gas and low carbon footprint.
Cleaner. Let me just bring you just one other thing that we want to talk about that came out of the film that we just saw from Nicholas, because it's pretty evident that from that report that the wealth has not reached the people of Senegal. It would be the oil companies that are benefiting here, and the government perhaps, but not the people themselves of Senegal. How do we address that imbalance?
I think there is 3 ways to have this gas for the benefit of the population. The first one is to start getting revenues coming from this gas, and these revenues will be financing the development infrastructure, development project. And we have a law that governs the revenue shares from this oil and gas revenues. The second step is to have more people involved in this project, like local content, and which is the case now. And the last step will be to industrialize the economics by using this gas to develop electricity, to develop petrochemicals, and this will definitely will be the benefits of the population. Today, the electricity access in Senegal is around 86%, and the objective is to reach 100% in 2029. And this gas will be used to have this objective achieved by 2029. And this will be the benefits of the population. And we are expecting also to have electricity with low cost, and this will be benefit also of the population, and also will accelerate the industrialization of the economy and the industrialization of the Senegal. And this will be the benefit of Senegalese people.
Well, thank you for that. That's Cherno Seydali speaking to us there from Dakar. And with that, that's our show for this week. Do get in touch with us on X at Nick Clark Al Jazz, and do use the hashtag AJCDC when you do. Or just drop us an email. counterthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online, of course, at aljazeera.com/CDC. That will take you straight to our page, which has a whole load of individual reports and lots of links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. So that's it for this edition of Counting the Costs. I'm Nick Clark from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is coming right up.